Hey, it's Savannah again, and I'll bet you thought you were never going to see the end of this series. To be honest, I got a little burnt out with all the things that have been going on in our lives. This cosplay took me a little bit over 8 months to complete, and then when I reviewed the footage, I got really discouraged because it was quite dark overall. But I realized that if you're here watching this type of video, you probably want the information more than care about the aesthetics. It's been long enough, so let me show you how I made Captain Flint's pants from Black Sails Season 3 and 4. So I noticed when reviewing the stills and the photos of the stunt doubles and the actors that some of the pants seemed more modernly cut, while others were more historical in nature. This was probably to accommodate for better movement with the stunt doubles. For my version, I tried to do a bit of an in-between. I had to watch the reference video that Mark Bowles sent to me over and over again to figure out how the pants were sectioned off, and what the back in particular looked like. But I finally came with the decision shown in my altered diagram pattern of how I put the pants together. I used a modern pattern to judge the size of the pants, and then I constructed a mock-up first and had the recipient try it on before beginning on the final product. For these pants, I decided to go with a mid-weight cotton canvas. So the first step for making these pants was to first put the hundreds of rows of machine stitching on each of the sections. This diagram shows all the directions of the different lines if you want to give this cosplay a go. I sewed all the rows about 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch apart, and if I remember correctly, it actually took me a little over a full workday just to do all the rows of stitching. Here's the whole pair of pants laid out after all the pieces were stitched. It was really helpful laying the pieces out because even though I made unique register marks on the pattern, it was still really easy to mix the pieces up, especially with no apparent wrong or right side to the fabric. I began by sewing the lower sections of the pants front together with 1/2 inch seam allowances. I also pinned and sewed the back pants upper and lower sections together with 1/2 inch seam allowances. I used a serger to finish these seams and press them before moving on to the next step. I then attached the now combined lower pieces to the upper piece of the front of the pants, and then I also carefully eased in the inner leg sections of the back of the pants to the newly formed back portion. Now I had fully formed leg pieces for both the front and the back of the pants, but before beginning final construction, I first wanted to go ahead and put in the opening and the side pieces of the pants. This is where your leg will go through at the bottom of the pants. It would be much easier to do it now rather than after it's been constructed. To make the openings, I first started out by marking out the slash and button positions on both the side leg pieces and the facing piece I was going to attach to them. I then searched around the facing piece and folded a piece of canvas the same length as the slash to act as a placket. I then sandwiched the placket piece between the side leg piece and the facing, carefully lining up the slash lines. I then stitched around the slash at about 1/8 inch with a very tiny stitch length. I cut the slash and flipped everything right side out and pressed everything. I then whip stitched the facing down by hand. Yes, this was a little complicated to do, but the resulting opening ended up being less bulky than a regular placket. I then marked out 4 buttonholes and finished them by hand with a matching heavy-duty thread. I usually use a very clean buttonhole stitch, but since this is a pirate costume, I opted to go with a whip stitch. This made a more rustic buttonhole, which looked a lot more like the original costume. Now it was time to start working on getting the center front and back seams of the pants put together. To begin with the front, I started by sewing the fly pieces together and trimming down the seam allowances. I flipped the fly right side out and then pressed it flat. I then serged the 2 fly facing pieces. I placed the fly down on the left front side of the pants just below the 5/8" seam allowance that the future waistband would take up. I then pinned the 2 fly facing pieces down over top of the fly piece and on the right side of the pants as well. I sewed both of these sections down from the top of the pants to just under the fly piece at 5/8" seam allowance. I then clipped the seam just under the fly, being careful not to cut the facing or the stitching. I then pressed the fly facings back and carefully pinned the rest of the pants center front seam together. I then stitched the seam and serged it, pressing the seam down to one side when it was finished. I then pinned the facings down over the seam in preparation to stitch everything securely in place. I then moved on to connecting the 2 back pieces together. To make the back facings, I cut 2 small rectangles of fabric and marked where the seam would end on the back of the pants as well as the facing pieces. I sewed the center back seam of the pants at 5/8 inches up to my mark, and then I also sewed the facing pieces up to my mark as well. I serged around the edge of the back facing piece and serged the center back seam where it had been sewn only. At the unfinished bit at the top of the back of the pants is where I pinned and sewed the facing to. The last step was to press the facing out and whip stitch it down. I actually did this at the same time I whip stitched the fly facings down. When securing the fly facings, I also put a few stitches in under the fly to help reinforce where the pants would be opened and closed constantly. Now it was finally time to put the whole pants together. I first pre-serged the long side edges of the pieces individually before sewing the side seams together. This was so that the pants could be altered later if they needed to be. I then sewed the sides together, and then finally the inseam. I serged the inseam to finish it as well. I pressed open all the side seams and then began adding gathering threads to the waist and the leg openings of the pants. I then got to sewing the waistband pieces together. I decided to sew the lines on the waistband once it was already put together. I made my way down from the top of the waistband, stopping just above the seam allowance so that I could still attach it to the pants. Since these 18th century pants have a split down the back, the pants actually have two waistbands, one slightly longer than the other to accommodate for the buttons. I carefully used the gathering threads to ease in the waistband onto the pants. I then sewed these on at 5/8 inch seam allowance. After removing all the pins, I carefully tucked the seam allowances up into the waistband and pinned them down so that I could do a couple more rows of machine stitching. I then had to carefully tie off and tuck in all of the little threads that were sticking out of the waistband. Luckily, the leg bands didn't have any stitching on them, so I proceeded as normal. The only thing that was tricky about them was getting the triangular points that go into the buckles equal in size and angled the same as each other. After finishing the leg bands off with a whip stitch, I made some eyelets for the buckles by hand. I then made a tab for the buckle to be attached to the cuff with. I flipped the tab right side out, ironed it, and then used an awl to make a hole for the buckle's prong to go through. After checking that the hole was in the correct place, I top stitched the tab onto the leg band. It's a lot easier to do this without the buckle on it. I then sewed the buckle onto the tab by hand, and the pant legs were finally finished. Lastly, I had to make the rest of the buttonholes for the waistband and fly, and finally some eyelets in the back of the waistband for the cord that would allow for minor size adjustments. Then it was time to put all 14 buttons on, and then the pants were finally finished at last. So here are the finished pants. These pants took me about 30 hours to complete overall. Fun fact, this is actually not the first pair of pants I've made. I made almost an entire first set, didn't like how they looked, and then started on these ones. Let me know what you think. Do they look like the original costume or not? Thanks again to Mark Bowles for sending me some of the behind the scenes photos and sharing the link of the video with me. Thank you for watching once again. I hope you enjoyed the video. I just wanted to let you know that I am slowly going to be working on a backlog of videos that we have saved. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments, and I will see you next time.